Hey, what's going on, people? Again, this T is true. I'm doing another video to finally talk about this 1080p 60 debate and holy grail, and hopefully put it to rest for a lot of people. If you understand the problem and what people mean and what they're hoping for in 1080p 60, and then how game development work or how games actually work on the hardware, it'll become clear that this whole, people demanding, oh, PS4, Xbox One must be 1080p 60. Every game should be 1080p 60 because well, just where they perceive the technology to be. And PC gamers have been playing at 1080p 60 forever, right? So it's like it's about time. But it'll never happen. It's not a realistic and attainable dream. Sure, some games will be 1080p 60. I mean, we already know of several games that will be 1080p 60, like Forza 5 and Killer Instinct, for example. But the idea that like every game will be 1080p 60 will never happen. And next generation, whatever it is, 4K 60, 4K 120 will never happen. Okay, and there's a reason for that if you understand the nature of the problem. So I'm just kind of tired of hearing and seeing constant threads and posts and titles and blogs. 1080p 60, why isn't that happening? It needs to happen, all this stuff. It's not going to happen, and it's a clear reason why, and here's why. Let's talk about it, okay? I have a link in this video to my blog that has a more in-depth article that I wrote about this, explaining this. But videos, I can kind of talk a little bit more freely in videos, right? So 1080p 60 won't ever happen because the nature of the problem, the idea that a game developer will have to make a choice in terms of what they prioritize. Should it be resolution? Should it be graphics complexity? Or should it be speed, i.e. frame rate? You can never prioritize. I mean, you can prioritize all three in a way, but you can never have the best of all three of those things. Okay, they're distinct and they affect each other. Okay, there's dependencies there between them. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. All right, as I said in the article. If you increase resolution, you are going to in effect be increasing the workload on the GPU, and that's going to cause the GPU to take longer to render the frames, assuming it's the same GPU and it's the same frames, the same game, and the same level of complexity. Increasing resolution by itself will ultimately reduce the frame rate, right? You can't grow both equally, right? If you increase the graphics complexity, you are in fact increasing the workload on GPU, which means it's going to take longer to do that amount of work. So you are effectively reducing the frame rate, right? So these things are interdependent, right? And I have some graphs that I'll show in a second. So let's do that now. What this graph is basically showing is that as you increase the complexity of a frame, basically increase the complexity of the game, the frame rate is going to go down, right? It's going to go lower, okay? This graph will never be flat, okay? Which means that they would essentially increase at the same rate, okay? Or increase equally. They won't, okay? So no matter how powerful a system is, right? PS5 from now, 10 years from now, or whatever, could be 100 times more powerful than PlayStation 3, PS3. But it wouldn't matter because the PS5 is not tasked to do the same things that the PS3 had to do. Okay, if that were the case, then sure, PS5 can probably run, take the relatively low complexity of PS3 games and run it, throw up the resolution to 4K or 8K or whatever, and have it run at 60 frames or 120 frames or whatever, because the extra horsepower of the system can be devoted to that, because the actual workload is pretty simple for a system that powerful, what that would be, right? But that's not the case. That's not how games ever evolve. Okay, games evolve where the user, the gamers, we want better graphics. We want more immersive, more realistic worlds. Um, we want Uncharted to not look like, Shadow of Colossus from PS2. Okay, if Uncharted did look like Shadow of Colossus on a PS3 and was designed as such, then that would probably be a game on a PS3 that can run at 1080p 60, because it's a relatively simple game for the PS3, and they can use that extra horsepower for the graphics card to say, I can do this simple workload really fast, right? I can do this thing in 60 frames, no problem. Okay, so then you could say, okay, let's increase the resolution to 1080p, and it says, oh, I still can do this in 60 frames, right? Because it has enough headroom, right? But when you design a game like Uncharted that has, models that are several times more complex than a PS2 game, and lighting algorithms that are way more complex, and post-processing effects, and everything, the whole nine, all of those things are going to add more of a heavy workload to the graphics card, right? Which means it's going to take longer to do it. And it's not going to be able to do it at 60 frames, right? So PS5 won't be able to do what will then be state-of-the-art graphics in 2022 or whatever, right? Or 2023. It won't be able to do state-of-the-art graphics at that time, most likely, right, at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second or whatever, right? It depends, right? So the point is that it's always a compromise to make. Okay, so just a quick correction. Earlier, I said a statement when I was talking about the graphs that the line can never be flat, which means that they can never grow at the same rate. And that's not true. That's an incorrect statement. What I really mean to say is that the line can't be flat, which means that you can't increase the complexity or frame or resolution without negatively affecting the frame rate. That's what that graph is showing. There's a negative relationship there, right? Inverse relationship. So as you increase one, you're going to decrease the frame rate. And that will always be the case, right? If we can increase our quality without affecting the frame rate, then everything can run at 60, 120, or whatever they want it to be. But you're always going to have that relationship where the frame rate is going to go down as you add more, basically, right? So I just wanted to make that correction real quick before I continue. So in conclusion, basically, I mean, you have to make a compromise. You have to accept either, increase complexity, increase frame resolution, which essentially is increasing the complexity, or frame rate, because the higher the complexity and the higher the resolution, the lower the frame rate is going to be for obviously the same, the same graphics card, that not changing. If you change these other variables in resolution and complexity, frame rate is going to suffer. So when a developer is looking at PS4 and Xbox One games, if they were going to develop, if EA was going to say, okay, we're basically going to take Battlefield Bad Company, the original, which was a game designed for like the PS3 and Xbox 360, and take that game and add some features and add some online and call it a day. Well, yeah, on the new hardware in the PS4, yeah, they have plenty of headroom to take that level of complexity and increase the resolution from 720 to 1080, and then the GPU in the PS4 is probably powerful enough to run that game through 60 frames per second, no problem. Okay, and we would get that. We would get great looking old games, right, at 1080p 60, but that's not what's happening, right? They're working on Battlefield 4, which is pushing the envelope in physics and AI and graphics and everything. The lighting is more advanced, the models are more advanced, the effects are more advanced, and they're adding, they're taking advantage of that new hardware and the new power to make the graphics more advanced, which ultimately is what we all want. That's what we all say. We want to keep seeing more realistic stuff, right? So they're doing that, but everything they add, comes at a cost. Right? There's no hardware that has no limitations. PS10 will still have some limits, right? So as you start approaching those limits, it's a balancing act. Okay, 30 frames per second is usually the minimum target. To have a great experience, right, when you're playing a game. And if you can keep it stable, it increases the experience, and that's fine. If you have headroom, you can get to 60, right? But if you're doing 60, that means that there's more that you can be doing with graphics and effects and stuff that you're not, okay? Because again, the GPU only has a finite amount of time. So now let's be clear, okay? Um, a lot of the people that say that 1080p 60 is the holy grail and demand it, basically what they're basically saying is that that should be the priority, right? Some people do understand everything I was already talking about in this video, but they're just saying, you know what, that's the baseline, right? That's the priority, right? Base minimum 1080p 60, and then everything goes from there, right? And I mean, sure, I mean, there's some people that's going to basically say, hey, I want the most resolution and the highest frame rate because that matters to me. But that's a little bit elitist, I would say, in a way. I mean, I'm a guy that works in graphics every day. I've been, this is my profession. I study this stuff. I worked at a game company. I've been playing games for over 20 years, 25 years. I want the best graphics as well, okay? But 720p games can still look great, and there's 30 frame per second games that are still great. Okay, some of the most fun games I've had in my history that I can remember, of course, with 30 frame per second games. I mean, Uncharted series is 30 frame per second, and it's still a great experience, right? Some of the Need for Speed games are some of the most fun I've had in the racer over the years. Of course, various generations in PlayStation 2 and 3 and whatever, and 1, and they're 30 frame per second games. So I mean, if you feel that way because you're used to the PC, that's fine. All right. But don't act like, 720p is just horrible and 30 frames per second is just horrible. I mean, you can still make enjoyable experiences, right, at those settings. All right. So let's just get over that. Okay. There can still be great games at those settings. In the future, when 1080p is old, I mean, and 4K is the standard, then 1080p games, of course, can still look great. I mean, again, to the average person especially, right? So yeah, it'd be nice to prioritize that. Again, if we had the minimum baseline to say, 1080p 60 or die. But particularly the frame rate part, I think the resolution, we're going to see 1080p pretty much be the standard this coming generation. Maybe not year one, but I think it will grow to that standard. But the frame rate is something that's always going to be a part of game development, going back to the Atari and going forth to, whatever, right? PS10. The frame rate is always going to be a function of the quality. And if you limited the frame rate to 60 frames per second, first of all, as I said before, you're basically limiting how much you can grow the graphics, right? I mean, how good you can get the game to look throughout the course of the console cycle. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, every game, and this is the second part, every game does not benefit from 60 frames. Right, there's certain games that it just doesn't really make sense, and then game developers, they're working on these things for years, so they know more than you guys probably do, and the average consumer does, and then I do it myself. I'm not making games now, right? So the bottom line is when they look at their game, they can see that the benefit and to the user of what they'll be able to see and how much more immersed they can get into the world by adding these various effects or this various physics and these various AI and that kind of stuff. That's more beneficial, right, to the gameplay experience than doubling the frame rate from 30 to 60, because in certain types of games you're not going to be able to see that difference anyway. Okay, RTSs, no. RPGs, not really. Because so racers, sure, fighting games, sure, those usually are the two most common, but some of these genres and game types, you either won't notice it at all, and it doesn't make sense to devote the extra horsepower to that, or it's a relatively small difference compared to what they could do with the extra horsepower running at 30. Okay, so if you feel that way, great. Okay, but I'm just saying, don't act like that's the only way it can be. Okay, you can still have great games at 720p still looks great in the living room. It doesn't look great on the PC, but it looks great in the living room for the average person. And 30 frames per second is enough to still have a great game experience. So, let's just get over that. Please just stop asking this question and talking about these demands. If that's what you prefer, that's great if you're a PC gamer. But every game next gen and the following gen does not have to be at 60 frames per second to be enjoyable. Developers know that. And as long as they do know that, they're going to make that sacrifice to give us better graphics and better worlds. And I think that's a fair trade. Some developers will still choose to focus on 60 frames, and that's fine. All right, so we're going to get some of both worlds, and in a lot of ways the best of both worlds. But the point of all of this is we'll never get only the world of 1080p 60. That's not going to be the universal standard now, and it never will be. And again, future generations, whatever that state of the art is, whatever resolution it is, 8K, it's never going to be the standard, because there's always reasons to choose otherwise. Okay, so please just stop it. Let's get over it. PS4, Xbox 3, Xbox One is coming. It's going to be great. Let's just enjoy these games and the experiences that we're going to have. All right.